I've had them in boxes in my garage. My parents passed away a few years ago, and I had time finally to go through a lot of this stuff, so I tried to pull out things that I thought the museum would be interested in. And so they range from a program from something we went to in the 90s versus way back in 1942. And that, so let me start here. And you know, it's interesting because I think a lot of this stuff is my dad collected when it wasn't easy to collect stuff because he didn't have the internet. You couldn't just Google this. And one of the things I found that I thought was pretty interesting was for the survivors of the Juneau, there was 10 survivors, and at some point the Navy declassified information, and it's their statements. So that's what these documents are, a lot of these statements. The person that I had met was a wonderful man by the name of Lester Zook that I think some of you have met. And it was interesting, I asked him about I met him and I asked him about my grandfather. I said, well, when was the last time you saw my grandfather? And he was a signalman, so he would have been up where my grandfather was. And he said, well, he was a little stressed and tortured about what was going on and some other things. It was interesting. And Lester said he was a little bit stressed because now when, and he has since passed away, he would meet people and they would always ask him about, did you see my son? Did you see, and that was something he had to do his whole life. But I met him I would go to some of these reunions, the ship reunions of the ship named after my grandfather, which was the lineman Knute Swensen, the Juneau reunions, and so I met him a few different times, so really good man. But that was the first thing that I think that I would like to give you. I don't know if you have these things already.
We don't.
Okay, so they're real interesting to read through. The guy speaking of what happened when they got in the water, why they weren't saved, you know, the sharks and all of it. So, so I brought you a number of those, and I have no idea where my dad went and where he got some of these things. I did bring this too on my grandfather. It's from the Lucky Bag, the Naval Academy. So it describes a little bit of him. His family was a Mormon family from Provo, Utah. And I went back to Provo and I met, it was his dad's brother's son. I met him when I was in Utah. And it was pretty interesting how my grandfather went from Provo, Utah into the Navy, because it looks like about the last place you'd go from. And the only thing I could think of is the Viking heritage, the Danish name, Vikings, and that, so maybe it was in his blood. So anyway, so I brought this, so I'll leave that. I have copies of these things, but I'll leave them with you and then that. Let's see, this was this is an interesting piece. It's the commanding officers of the crew of the USS Juneau request that your company at the commissioning ceremonies be held on board the USS Juneau on Saturday morning, 14th of February at 11 o'clock. So this must have been, I guess, beginning of 1942. So that was, I found that in their stuff. So I think to me that's a valuable, you know, something I think is really neat. That was for the Juneau. This was for the commissioning of my grandfather's ship, the launching of the USS Lyman K. Swenson, which was in 1944. A little bit interesting thing about this is my father graduated from Annapolis in 3 years because they moved him up instead of the normal 4 years because of the war, and he ended up being on the ship named after my grandfather. And he says it was an accident. I mentioned that to Kelly last night. She's going, no, Navy knew what they were doing. So I don't know. And his career, I asked him about the Swenson sailed to, they ended up in Japan as the war ended. And I guess what he told me is that he had about 17 days of action, that they were totally afraid of the kamikazes. That was their big stress. And I said, well, we do all day. He said, well, did you just train? And then when he was about 80, I was talking to him. I said, well, where were you when the war ended? He goes, oh, I was in Tokyo. I went on land, and he had a pistol, which I never knew my dad ever did, to do that. I was just thinking, Dad, I can't believe you did that. You never told me when the war ended that happened. I think, to me, I was fascinated by it, and he said, he goes, there wasn't really much to do because everything was bombed out. There weren't stores or anything. So weren't you afraid because the war ended? And he said the Japanese would go after you. He goes, no, they had so much respect for their emperor that they knew they'd be left alone, which, you know, I was just fascinated that he didn't tell me that when I was like 12 years old. I had to ask him about that.